Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about the HOA that cut down all my trees. My property was spacious, covered with tall, old trees that provided shade in the summer and a sense of comfort year-round. I cherished that land. In my early 20s, I invested my savings from years of part-time jobs, help from my mother, and a small inheritance from my grandfather into purchasing it. It was my pride and joy. A place I intended to raise my children someday and enjoy retirement with my partner, though I hadn't yet met that special someone. For nearly a decade, everything ran relatively smoothly. My neighbors were friendly enough, the local community events were pleasant, and I was left alone to take care of my property as I saw fit. But things took a sharp turn when a group of individuals decided to re-establish the Homeowners Association. Initially, I wasn't too concerned. I had heard about HOAs, how some could be controlling, but my personal experience had been that any collective decisions were made with minimal fuss. Besides, for years, we only had an informal neighborhood committee that mostly organized holiday gatherings. However, this new board labeled itself as the official HOA and assured everyone they had the proper legal authority to manage community standards. They boasted how they would protect property values and keep the neighborhood safe. And although that talk made me a bit uneasy, I decided to give them the benefit of the doubt. How bad could it be? Well, as it turned out, very bad. Their rules started small. I'd find little notices taped to my mailbox regarding things like where garbage bins could be placed or the length of grass allowed in front yards. At first, I tried to comply or at least reason with them. It wasn't too invasive, even though these were my personal decisions. Did it really matter if my bins were a few inches off the recommended mark? But I told myself not to start trouble. Then, the notices became more frequent, mentioning trivial details like the color of my fence posts or the shape of my mailbox. I thought it was ludicrous. Still, not wanting to stir the pot, I replaced my mailbox with the recommended style, even though I personally preferred the older one. I guess I didn't want them breathing down my neck. A few months passed and they ramped up their efforts. Suddenly, the HOA insisted on adjusting our backyard landscaping to match some standard they had hastily created. I attended one of their community meetings, my first and last official attendance, to better understand what they were trying to achieve. The meeting was chaotic, and it appeared that a small group of members was controlling the entire conversation. They talked about uniformity in the neighborhood, ensuring that every yard looked identical, and the importance of maintaining perfectly manicured lawns. My property, with its tall trees and somewhat wild aesthetic, didn't fit their description of what was acceptable. I came away from that meeting feeling alarmed by the power they seemed to wield, though part of me thought they were all talk. After all, I'd never signed any updated agreement with them. My property was never part of any strict covenant. There had been a defunct HOA ages ago, but it was practically non-existent by the time I purchased my home. As far as I understood, I was exempt, and if they tried to enforce anything, they'd have to deal with local laws, which I believed still protected my rights to my own backyard. But my intuition told me to stay on guard, so I installed a few discreet security cameras around the perimeter of my property, just in case anyone got any bright ideas. Most of my cameras were actually intended to watch for wildlife or potential trespassers who might do mischief. I never dreamed I'd use them to gather evidence for a lawsuit involving my own neighbors. The tension continued to climb when the HOA board, led by a man named Bennett, who was particularly insistent about neighborhood conformity, started issuing formal letters citing violations. I received warnings about my fence height, the style of my garden shed, and even the color of my compost bin. They threatened fines, and though they never mailed me an official invoice, they plastered the notices everywhere. I'd find them on my door, my mailbox, even on my car windshield. One morning, I woke up to a notice taped to my door with a demand that I remove a portion of my old orchard because, as they claimed, the fruit trees were too close to the property line. But those trees had been there long before I bought the place, and actually, they predated even the original construction of some neighboring homes. At that point, I sought legal advice from a friend named Marcia, who worked at a local law firm. I just wanted clarity. Could an HOA formed recently truly dictate that I cut down heritage fruit trees on my own property? Marcia assured me that I had a strong legal stance against any forced removal. She suggested that if the HOA tried anything, I should document every interaction. So I started a notebook, writing down dates, times, and the nature of each communication. And of course, I made sure my cameras were always running, and that their footage was saved to multiple backups. Sure enough, a few days after I started meticulously documenting everything, I found a padlock on my gate. It was a shiny, brand new lock I'd never seen before, with a note attached saying that until I complied with the neighborhood standards, the gate would remain locked. The note ended with a condescending remark about them protecting me from myself. This was the final straw. The gate opened to a small walkway that cut through the side of my yard to a local trail. It was my private property, and they had absolutely no right to block my access to it. Furious, I grabbed my bolt cutters and removed the padlock. I kept it as evidence, photographing it from every angle. Then I wrote a strongly worded letter to Bennett and the rest of the board, demanding they cease and desist all unauthorized actions on my property. I sent it by certified mail so I could have proof of receipt. I thought that would be enough to scare them off, or at least get them to reconsider their approach, but I underestimated the lengths to which they would go. About a week after I cut off their lock, I heard chainsaws on a Saturday morning. It was around 7 a.m., and the buzzing sounds jolted me awake. I looked out my window to see a group of workers, complete strangers, chopping down my beloved trees. My orchard, and even some decorative trees near the fence line, were being cut down with shocking speed. I was stunned. I raced outside in my pajamas, screaming for them to stop. A man wearing a neon vest told me to step away because work was being done according to HOA guidelines. I demanded identification, but he refused to give me any and just said, "Talk to the board if you have any questions." In disbelief, I tried to stop them physically, which was probably a bad idea given they had running chainsaws. But I couldn't just stand there while they destroyed my property. Realizing I was in danger if I approached too closely, I bolted back inside and called the police. The dispatcher was sympathetic and told me officers were on their way. Meanwhile, my cameras were capturing everything. The trucks pulling in, the workers ignoring my protests, the trees hitting the ground. The orchard that had been in my yard for decades was being demolished right in front of my eyes. By the time the police arrived, most of the damage was done. Several trees lay on their sides, and a pile of wood chips was all that remained of the orchard that once provided apples, cherries, and pears to me and my neighbors. I was nearly in tears, furious, heartbroken, and shaking. The police asked the workers for documentation authorizing them to be on my property. They had none. The workers claimed they'd been hired by the HOA to perform community beautification. One of the officers told them to pack up and leave immediately because they were blatantly trespassing. The workers, clearly unsettled, put away their tools and left, but not before shooting me angry looks as though I were in the wrong. I had half a mind to tackle Bennett the moment I saw him. Instead, I kept calm and did things through legal channels. I called Marcia in a panic, explained the entire situation, and within an hour, she had a legal team drafting letters, filing a lawsuit for trespassing, property damage, and a laundry list of additional claims. I also made sure to file a police report detailing the incident, including the destruction of private property. By the next day, I had multiple visits from neighbors who had heard about the ruckus, some offering sympathy and others offering half-hearted apologies for not intervening. I held them blameless because it wasn't their job to physically stop a group of workers with chainsaws. However, I did notice something interesting. Many neighbors had begun to share stories about how the HOA had threatened them too, some with fines or unapproved modifications. It was clear that the board had gone rogue and we were all potential victims of their overreach. What made matters worse was the emotional attachment I had to those trees. They weren't just random plants. They had sentimental value. My mother loved my orchard, especially the cherry trees, and we used to sit in their shade each summer, sharing stories about her childhood. Some of the fruit trees had been planted by the previous owner, who was an avid gardener and whose legacy I had promised to maintain. To see them ripped away was gut-wrenching, and the fact that they had put a lock on my gate claiming ownership or control over my own property was icing on the cake of their arrogance. The camera footage turned out to be a goldmine of evidence. Not only did it show the workers trespassing and cutting down my trees, but it also caught Bennett himself in the background at one point, supervising the work from a distance. He was standing near the curb, arms folded, watching as branches fell. He even answered a phone call during the process, looking entirely unconcerned with the blatant destruction. Marcia's legal team rejoiced at having such clear proof. It made the lawsuit practically airtight. I was relieved I hadn't confronted them more aggressively, because everything was caught on camera in a calm, methodical manner from my side. I looked like the victim who tried to peacefully reason with these individuals, which was precisely what happened. In the weeks that followed, the HOA tried a variety of tactics to dodge responsibility. First, they claimed that I had secretly signed an agreement allowing for the removal of those trees. That was, of course, an outright lie, and we had no trouble disproving it by referencing property records and the absence of any such signed documentation. Then they tried to push the blame onto the workers, as if the workers had taken it upon themselves to cut down trees at random. But the camera footage clearly showed Bennett's involvement. Plus, we had statements from the workers that they were hired by the HOA. Lastly, they tried to claim that the orchard was a public nuisance, but the city had never received any complaints or official statements to support that. Everything was a poorly disguised smokescreen to avoid liability. On a personal level, I felt an intense mixture of anger and sadness. I was angry they had the audacity to believe they could do whatever they liked to my property, and I was sad that those beautiful, mature trees were gone. Replacing them would take years, maybe decades, to restore the same ambiance, but I was determined to see justice done. Every day, I diligently recorded new notices that still appeared on my property. The HOA, despite the lawsuit, continued to threaten me with fines for everything from improper fence maintenance to unauthorized landscaping. Each new notice only strengthened my case. One day, my friend Joshua, who lived in the neighborhood across from mine, came over to share his own story. He explained how the HOA had threatened him with a lien on his property for having the wrong style of shutters. That was the first time I heard about them threatening a lien. The entire concept was illegal for them to do without proper process, but it showed how brazen they were becoming. He was terrified of losing his home, so he had complied, spending thousands on correct shutters that matched some arbitrary code. Hearing his story made me even more resolved not to let them get away with this tyranny. A few months into the legal proceedings, we had a preliminary court date to establish the scope of the lawsuit. Marcia's team presented the video evidence and the documentation of property destruction and trespassing. The HOA's legal counsel looked visibly nervous. Bennett, who appeared at the hearing with a smug expression, tried to argue that all of this was for the greater good of the neighborhood, that my orchard was unattractive and potentially lowered property values. However, the judge didn't seem to buy into that argument at all. He questioned their legal standing to forcibly remove trees from private property, especially since I had never agreed to be part of their new association or any updated covenants. Their arguments fell apart on the spot. The judge was also disturbed by the locked gate incident. When asked to explain it, Bennett clumsily stumbled through a statement about safety protocols, but he had no legitimate explanation for restricting my own access to my land. The judge made it clear that this would likely be a straightforward case of trespass and property damage, with potential punitive damages awarded due to the blatant, willful nature of their actions. The footage left no doubt that they had intentionally destroyed my trees, and the police reports backed it up. During the discovery phase, we uncovered even more incriminating evidence. Emails between Bennett and other board members were found, in which they openly discussed how to make an example out of me, bragging that, once we show we can do this, the others will fall in line. They talked about enforcing uniformity and some twisted ideology about controlling every aspect of the neighborhood. This was pure gold for my legal team. In one particular email, Bennett even acknowledged that I hadn't signed any of their updated agreements, but wrote, "If we just act, I doubt he has the resources to fight us." That part made my blood boil, especially because it showed how callous and arrogant they were. They were banking on me being unable or unwilling to take them on legally. Marcia's team kept me informed at every turn. We were seeking damages not only for the cost of replacing the trees, but also for emotional distress and the legal fees. The orchard alone was valued at tens of thousands of dollars, especially given that some of the varieties were rare and quite old. Then there was the matter of the ornamental trees near the fence line, plus other property damage. When all was tallied up, we reached a figure that was close to $250,000 in actual damages. Adding in punitive damages for their malicious conduct, the number soared higher. The turning point came when Bennett apparently tried to intimidate one of my witnesses, a neighbor named Dawn who had seen everything unfold that morning and was willing to testify. Dawn told me he showed up at her doorstep and hinted that her pretty new patio might need to be torn down if it didn't meet the HOA's guidelines. She told him straight up to leave her property and that she would be notifying the authorities about his harassment. That sealed his fate. Dawn provided a written statement about his attempt to threaten her, which further solidified the case that the HOA was acting under color of authority in an abusive and unlawful manner. When we finally went to trial, it was almost anticlimactic. The evidence was overwhelming. We had videos, police reports, witness testimonies, even their internal emails. The jury didn't need long to deliberate. They found in my favor on all counts. The judge awarded me $297,433 in damages. That number was significant enough to cover the full replacement value of the trees, the cost of rehabilitating the land, though the orchard would take years to regrow, my legal fees, and punitive damages that were tacked on to punish the HOA's blatant disregard for my rights. The HOA, or more accurately, its board, was on the hook for the entire amount. But that wasn't the end of the story. As if the civil judgment wasn't enough, local law enforcement pursued criminal charges against Bennett and a couple of board members who had been deeply involved. They were charged with trespassing, vandalism, and in Bennett's case, a couple of other counts that related to attempting to coerce or intimidate witnesses. The trial for those charges took place separately from my civil case, but the evidence was largely the same. Once again, the videos and emails proved that these individuals had orchestrated an unlawful operation. Bennett, who had tried so desperately to appear as a leader, ended up facing the worst consequences. After the verdict, he was actually taken into custody right there in court. I felt a mixture of relief and disbelief seeing them literally in handcuffs. While part of me never wanted it to escalate to criminal charges and jail time, I couldn't deny a sense of justice. They had no remorse for violating people's rights, ignoring property lines, and destroying personal property. They never even apologized. In fact, Bennett maintained until the very end that he had the neighborhood's best interests at heart, which was absurd. He even tried blaming me for not following procedure, as if that somehow justified cutting down my orchard. Word of the court's decision spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some folks were in shock that an HOA board could behave in such an outlandish manner. Others, especially those who had been bullied and threatened by the board, felt vindicated. Joshua, my friend who replaced his shutters out of fear, told me he was now exploring options to recoup his losses as well. A class action lawsuit was rumored to be forming among the neighbors who'd been harassed or extorted for fees. The entire experience galvanized the community in a way I had never seen before. People were finally standing up to the notion that an HOA could do whatever it wanted without consequence. In the aftermath, the newly formed HOA effectively collapsed. The board members who weren't jailed or charged resigned en masse, not wanting to face further lawsuits. Some tried to quietly relocate to different neighborhoods, presumably to avoid local embarrassment. Although I considered the ordeal mostly over, I did receive a few calls from folks trying to persuade me to settle early or accept partial payments, but Marcia's team advised me not to relent. The court order was crystal clear. They owed me the full $297,433, plus interest if they delayed payments. Eventually, after some complex negotiations, a portion of that money was paid out by the HOA's insurance, and the rest was taken from the personal assets of the board members who orchestrated the fiasco. I used part of that settlement to begin replanting my orchard. I consulted with arborists to figure out the best new trees to plant and how to restore my land. I also upgraded my security system with even more cameras, floodlights, and signage clearly stating that trespassers would be prosecuted. While I didn't want to feel like a fortress, I also refused to let anybody walk all over my rights again. The orchard rehabilitation became a kind of community project. Some neighbors even pitched in their time or resources because they felt awful about what happened. It was heartening to see the outpouring of support. It made me realize that the board's actions didn't represent the true spirit of the people in my neighborhood. An unexpected but touching side story developed during this process when I was approached by the grandson of the original owner, who'd planted many of the now destroyed trees. He had heard about the destruction and wanted to pay his respects, bringing old photographs and newspaper clippings showing the orchard's earliest days. We decided to dedicate a small plaque to commemorate his grandfather's vision. It was a bittersweet experience because I knew we could never truly replace those decades-old trees in my lifetime, but at least we could honor the legacy and start anew. There was another subplot that emerged when local news outlets caught wind of the story. A journalist reached out, asking to film my yard and the stump remains of my once grand orchard. They interviewed me about property rights and the dangers of an overreaching HOA. I was cautious at first, not wanting to be in the spotlight. But I realized that sharing my story might help others who were in similar situations, unsure how to stand up for their rights. The news piece aired, and I got emails from total strangers thanking me for shedding light on how unscrupulous HOA practices could be. Some told me their own horror stories, and it really opened my eyes to how many people across the country have battled HOAs that go too far. Another surprising angle involved my father. He had initially been skeptical about my decision to take legal action against the HOA. He thought it would become a huge hassle and worried that the stress would take a toll on my health. My father grew up in a time when you just tried to keep the peace with neighbors at all costs. But after he saw what they had done, especially how they locked my gate and then destroyed trees that held sentimental value, he became my biggest supporter. He attended every court hearing, took notes, and even coached me on how to present myself in court. My father always said, "Your home is your sanctuary, and no one should tear it apart without facing the consequences." Seeing him transform from cautious observer to fierce advocate made me incredibly proud. In the end, Bennett and a couple of his cronies served actual jail time. It wasn't years behind bars, but the judge wanted to send a message that such flagrant disregard for private property rights would not be tolerated. They also faced hefty fines and criminal records that would follow them. To some people, that might have seemed harsh for what started as an HOA dispute, but once you account for the level of destruction, the intimidation tactics, and the complete lack of remorse, it felt like justice was served. The new orchard I'm planting is a testament to how personal property, especially something as meaningful as land and trees, can't just be trampled on by power-hungry individuals. Another minor plotline that reinforced my decision to protect my land happened about a year after the lawsuit concluded. My childhood friend Giselle visited from out of state. She remembered when we were kids, I used to always talk about owning a house with a big orchard. It had been my dream, something I associated with long-term stability and harmony. After hearing my story, she was shocked that an HOA would stoop so low. But she also admired how the community ultimately rallied around me once the truth came out. It reminded me that while some organizations or individuals might become corrupted by power, there are still good neighbors and friends out there who value fairness and respect. Despite the heartbreak of losing trees that held decades of history, I can honestly say I'm in a better place now. The settlement money, while never bringing back the original orchard, allowed me to invest in extensive landscaping that will benefit me for years to come. I hired reputable landscapers, planted various saplings, and have plans to construct a lovely garden area that neighbors can enjoy, with my permission, of course. I also installed benches and a small gazebo in memory of my mother, who had loved to sip tea under those old branches. Although it will take time for my new trees to grow, I can already see small blossoms and fresh leaves that give me hope. In a broader sense, this ordeal taught me a valuable lesson about standing up for myself. There are times in life when you have to pick your battles, and there are times when you must fight with every ounce of strength you have. Had I folded under the HOA's pressure early on, they would have continued trampling over not just my rights, but potentially those of everyone else in the neighborhood. Instead, I exposed them, and now the entire community is free from their overbearing rule. Joshua no longer has nightmares of losing his home to a lien over shutters. Dawn can relax on her patio without fear of intimidation, and the neighborhood, ironically enough, feels more unified now that we've banded together to address a common threat. The legal victory also serves as a cautionary tale for anyone else thinking about abusing an HOA's authority. By awarding me $297,433, the court set a precedent that property rights can't be sidelined by the whims of a power-hungry group. More importantly, the criminal charges made clear that there are serious consequences for trespassing and destroying private property, no matter how righteous someone believes their cause to be. When Bennett walked into court that day, smug and certain he was untouchable, he probably never imagined leaving in handcuffs. Over time, I've come to appreciate the significance of capturing everything on camera. I'm generally a private person, but if I hadn't installed those cameras, it might have ended up as a he said, she said dispute. The cameras didn't just show the chainsaws and trucks pulling up. They caught Bennett's face, his gestures, his direct involvement. The crisp audio recorded the workers saying they were hired by the HOA to do the job. No judge or jury could deny the obvious truth right in front of their eyes. I'm not suggesting everyone cover their homes in cameras, but I do think it's wise to protect your property, especially if you suspect someone might overstep boundaries. In my case, those cameras were the difference between a messy argument and a clear, decisive legal win. Once the dust settled, I held a modest gathering in my backyard, really just a small barbecue, to celebrate the new chapter. I invited friends, sympathetic neighbors, and a few family members. We stood near the freshly planted trees and toasted to a future in which no one would cut them down without facing serious consequences. The mood was surprisingly uplifting. There was a real sense of closure and optimism. Although we all missed the majestic shade of the old orchard, we also recognized that something positive had grown out of the turmoil. A tighter-knit community, a clarified sense of our rights, and a reassertion that no bully with a clipboard can take what is rightfully ours. A funny moment happened at that barbecue when one of the neighbors joked about forming a new association, but this time specifically dedicated to protecting each homeowner's right to customize their property however they like as long as it doesn't harm anyone else. We had a good laugh about that, but we also recognized the seriousness behind the joke. People were ready to reclaim their autonomy and ensure that no small cabal of individuals could ever again unilaterally decide what the rest of us could do in our own backyards. If there was any good that came from this nightmare, it was the renewed appreciation for personal freedom and respect for the boundaries that separate your property from someone else's domain. The aftermath for the individuals who went to jail was apparently quite dramatic. Bennett's job situation imploded, as his employer didn't take kindly to having an employee with a criminal record for property destruction and trespassing. Some of the other board members found themselves facing personal financial ruin. While I never reveled in their personal misfortunes, it was hard to feel sympathy given the trauma they caused me. They had gleefully taken away something precious from me, hoping I was too scared or too poor to fight back. As fate would have it, they drastically underestimated my resolve. Even though I've rebuilt much of what was lost, some part of me still grieves the old orchard as it was. I remember the way the apple blossoms would look in the early spring, how I could sit under the branches with a book, hidden from the world in a cool patch of shade. It was where I found solace, especially after stressful weeks at work. No amount of settlement money can truly replace a lifetime of memories tied to that land, but at least I can pass on the story to future generations. How I stood up for something that mattered, how I didn't let an overzealous association bully me out of my private sanctuary, and how important it is to fight for your rights even if you're battling an entire organization. Friends, thank you. See you soon.